Our after-lunch speaker is Dr. István Lánczky of Budapest. Unfortunately, Dr. Lánczky cannot be here with us in person, so he will deliver his lecture on Zoom. Dr. Lánczky's subject of research in general is Arabic philosophy, in particular that of Avicenna, about whom he wrote his doctoral thesis. Very appropriately, he is Deputy Director of the Avicenna Institute of Middle Eastern Studies in Budapest. Dr. Lánczky also works at the Eötvös Loránd Research Center. Unlike the recently established Avicenna Institute, of which Dr. Lánczky is Deputy Director, the Eötvös Loránd University is one of the oldest universities in Hungary. During its long history, it has had several names and was the university with which Goldziher was associated in one way or another for most of his life. Dr. Lánczky is going to talk to us about ofʁUlūm al-Awāİl, the sciences of the ancients, a topic which also crops up in the works of Ignaz Goldziher. The title of his talk is At the Crossroads of ofʁUlūm al-Awāİl and the Islamic Sciences, some remarks on Ibn Ghaylan al-Balkhi's encounter with Fakhr ad-Din al-Razi. Dr. Lánczky, we wish you a speedy recovery and good health, and we look forward to hearing your lecture. Please.
Thank you very much for your kind words. I hope that everyone can hear what I'm saying. And I would like to start by thanking to the organizers that they made possible this presentation via Zoom. And I am also very grateful for the invitation because I don't really feel qualified for this presentation because of my age and because of my qualification, I would say, but I will try to do my best to represent the younger generation of Hungarian researchers. Ignaz Goldziher is one of the few scholars in humanities whose genius is still shining nowadays, despite 100 years since his era. At the beginning of the 20th century, the possibilities and perspectives of this science were relatively limited compared to our age. The available books were fewer and the flow of information was slower. Nevertheless, besides his enormous contributions to what are now different fields of Islamic studies, Ignaz Goldziher was consciously reflecting on the state of the art of this science. When it comes to the methodology and subject matter, he eloquently readdressed the question against the background of the scientific innovations of his era. As he makes clear in his Die Fortschritte der Islamwissenschaften in den letzten 3 Jahrzehnten, that now, that is at the beginning of the 20th century, the Islamic sciences not only possessed more books, but also had different scientific perspectives and methodologies than, for example, in Hadrian Roland's time in the early 18th century. Ignaz Goldziher was a conscious and modern scholar. He consciously applied critical historicism, supplementing it with comparative religious studies that had just started to evolve in his time. Second, with a retrospection to the past 30 years, he underlines the importance of the ever-increasing knowledge on the Islamic countries, thanks to the publication of theological treatises enabled by the appearance and spread of the press in the Middle East. Somewhat ironically, Goldziher's assessments are standing even now, but with a shift of accent. Now, at the beginning of the 21st century, we possess a lot more data than 100 years ago, at least quantitatively. Islamic studies witnessed a significant change in the last century, similarly to the other sciences. First, primary and secondary literature showed a quantitative explosion in the past 30 years, not to mention the paradigm change that digital data's appearance means and will mean in the next decades. Second, the Islamic sciences also witnessed a methodological evolution. Not only the Orientalist and post-colonial discourses, but also the recent sociological and philosophical trends of approaching and defining religion or culture. In the following few minutes, my presentation will revolve around the axis represented by Goldziher's article, Die Stellung der alten islamischen Orthodoxie zu den antiken Wissenschaften. I want to focus on an evergreen cultural question that has always sparked the attention of scholars: the role of the antique heritage and its integration into the Islamic sciences. Ignaz Goldziher's article, Die Stellung der alten islamischen Orthodoxie zu den antiken Wissenschaften, is among his extensively cited articles highlighting the fierce resistance of the so-called Islamic Orthodox circles to the foreign sciences, the Greek philosophical legacy. Ignaz Goldziher also clarifies that Greek logic was later incorporated into the madrasa curriculum, and this process ofʿ played an important role. That continued to be a subject matter until very recently. That is to say, the Greek sciences have an ambivalent role in the Islamic sciences. It is a foreign element that was rejected at times, but was also accepted until it became actually part of the story. If someone focuses on these processes as part of what we might call Islamic culture, the Greek legacy's case is exciting. It seems to represent a front line to which different parties had to relate somehow. And as such, it describes the attitude of the scientific currents in the Islamic societies. To recapitulate the obvious, when the Muslims conquered a considerable part of the Fertile Crescent that had been Hellenized before centuries, they confronted a culture that was based on Judaism, Christianity, and the Greek heritage, such as rhetoric schools, medicine, or theology, etc. After the early Abbasid period, when al-Ma'mun established the Bayt al-Hikmah to initiate the translation movement, most of the Alexandrian philosophical curriculum became available in Arabic, which gave rise to the golden age, as Dimitri Gutas called it, of Arabic philosophy, with such thinkers as al-Kindi, al-Farabi, and Avicenna. Especially Avicenna, who produced a system that was such a proper answer to the theological, cultural challenges that its influence lasted in the centuries to come, provoking the attention of al-Ghazali, who condemned him as a heretic in 3 questions. This is the beginning of a new era when Ghazalians tried to refute Avicennan philosophy with an Asharite background, which, by reflecting on philosophical tenets, would not avoid being philosophized to a certain extent. The leading figure of this attitude is Fakhruddin al-Razi, who is the protagonist of the following few minutes. To frame the question of how foreign elements found their way into the Islamic sciences, we will quickly travel to the early 13th century Samarkand, where Ibn Ghaylan al-Balkhi met Fakhruddin al-Razi and talked about the eternity of the world. In this debate, a striking element appears as a point of controversy. Avicenna's modal distinction of existence, the base of what is known as the Burhan al-Siddiqi. On the occasion of this event, I will focus on one sub-question of this particular argument and its history. The Burhan al-Siddiqin is an elegant way of proving God's existence, but it entails the eternity of the world, which cannot be accepted based on the scriptures. Thus, I will try to follow how this argument reshaped the discussions in Juwayni, Ghazali, and Shahristani. Who is Fakhruddin? Fakhruddin al-Razi needs perhaps no introduction. Actually, he is a prolific writer who played a central role in the formation of the philosophical Asharism and the Hikmah tradition in the Eastern Islamic culture that practically redressed philosophy in an Islamic garment. He was born in Ray and died in Herat in 1210. He is most famous for his Quranic commentary, but his efforts to synthesize Asharism with Avicennian philosophy are perhaps his best achievements. And who is Ibn Ghaylan? Although little is known about his life, Ibn Ghaylan al-Balkhi is also linked to the eastern provinces. Nevertheless, our latest indication about his life is exactly the story we are about to tell. Fakhruddin al-Razi met him in Samarkand before 1205, so he probably died around that time. Ibn Ghaylan was a Ghazalian who continued the project of discrediting Avicenna. His most famous work, among some logical and medical treatises, is the Kitab Huduth al-Alam, the book on the creation of the world, in which he refutes Avicenna's arguments against the temporal creation of the world. Now let's turn to the story. As Fakhraddin entered Samarkand, he immediately hurried to Ibn Ghaylan's house, whose great reputation as a humble and famous scholar was widely known. Nevertheless, Ibn Ghaylan seems to have made him wait in the foyer for a longer period. This impoliteness struck Fakhraddin, as he articulates it, so when Ibn Ghaylan finally showed up, he returned this attitude in a similar impolite manner. It practically meant straight questions by which Fakhraddin tore Ibn Ghaylan's opinion on the eternity of the world apart. Conclusion: never make Fakhraddin Razi angry. The debate has principally two parts. In the first, Fakhraddin asks Ibn Ghaylan about his book against Avicenna. Fakhraddin seems indeed very curious, apart from being angry, because in many of his works, he dealt with the eternity of the world, openly hesitating which way to choose: the theological solution of the creation of the world or the philosophical solution of its eternity. Upon Fakhraddin's straight questions, it quickly turns out that Ibn Ghaylan only refuted the philosopher's argument. It is a well-known kalam method, the ilzam, destroying the opponent's view without proving the real truth. It is more like an ad hominem argument that does not go into any philosophical depth. Al-Ghazali, for example, tells about three kinds of theological reasonings in the Al-Iqtisad fil-I'tiqad, the Sarb al-Taqsim, the Tartib al-Usul, and the Ilzam. And it is the third, where it is not important to prove the postulate, only that the opponent's view is impossible. Fakhraddin simply wins by leading Ibn Ghaylan to silence because Ibn Ghaylan has no idea of the philosophical arguments or their strength whatsoever. This is an important moment in our story. The theologian's dialectic kind of argumentation, the ilzam, is a usual method in kalam circles. As we will see, it is here where Fakhraddin represents a turning point. After working so much on philosophy, he is not satisfied with a pure critic. Instead, he sticks to a proper demonstration to unveil the truth. The second part of the debate starts with a substantial question of Fakhraddin's, which will be the other axis of our presentation. Avicenna's modal distinction of existence. I quote, when the conversation ended up here, he stood still and did not mention anything else. Then Fakhraddin Razi, said, there is another point more important than the one we just mentioned. It is to inquire about how to solve the conflict. This is what we say. We either claim that the possibility of creation of created things has a first and beginning, or we claim that there is no first for the possibility of their creation and has no beginning of the probability of their existence. If we say that the possibility of their creation has a first and a beginning, before that beginning point, it follows that it was either necessary in itself or impossible in itself, then it turned possible in itself. If it was necessary in itself, then the statement of eternity follows. But if it were impossible in itself, then turned possible, follows the turning of thing from impossible in itself into possible in itself or necessary in itself, and then the door of proving the knowledge of the creator is closed. If we said the possibility of creation of the created things has no first, then you accepted that they are possible to become forever. How do you claim with this that it is impossible to become forever? Because it requires the connection of the two contradictory statements. And this is what a reasonable person doesn't say. Afterwards, Ibn Ghaylan stood still for a long time. His face became colored and his limbs started shaking. After a while, he comes up with a typical Asharite answer, namely that before coming into existence, the world was absolute non-existent, that cannot be the subject of inquiry. But Fakhraddin quickly rules out this option, saying that in this case, even this assertion is false. Be that as it may, from now on, we focus on this particular argument, which will be the guideline to show the evolution on the scientific focus from the 11th to the 13th century. So what is this all about? This argument divides existence into possible, impossible, or necessary. It is a basic ontological distinction which describes the existence of things. Modality, necessity, possibility, and impossibility are closely linked to existence. Whatever exists is either necessary or possible. There are things that are impossible in themselves to exist. For example, a quadrangular circle. It is per definitionem impossible, so there is no way that it exists. For the possible, take the example of apples. An apple might exist and it might not exist. If I go to the grocery store, I see apples, but I easily could not see apples if there is no season. An apple in itself is such a thing that it might exist, but it doesn't always exist necessarily. If the apple always existed necessarily, the universe would be a huge apple. This is fortunately not the case. Thus, only one existence is necessary in itself, namely God. It is a well-known idea in the Islamic world that this tripartite system was usually attributed to Avicenna. The argument called the Burhan al-Siddiqin is based on this distinction. It proves God's necessary existence based on the assumption that in the world around us, there are possible things like apples. Apples can exist and cannot exist. If every existent is possible, and the cause of a possible is possible, and its cause is also possible, this chain would run ad infinitum. Thus, there must be a necessary cause in itself whose existence is not grounded in anything else. Second, if an effect necessitated by a real cause lasts until the cause is there. Thus, an eternal cause, like God, would entail an eternal sequence of effects. It would entail the eternity of the world. So the problem is the following. If we accept this basic idea that apart from God, everything is possible in itself, and God creates eternally, he creates eternally the possible things, namely apples. In this formula, the world is created due to its need for a cause, and it is causally dependent on God, but its possibility is eternal because God could create it in any time. This consequence posed a serious challenge for the mutakallimun, who were attracted by its elegance and simplicity, but they had to defend somehow the eternity of the world. So as to assess this process, we need to go back to the formative period of Muslim rational theology. Every monotheistic religion teaches creation, that God created the world. Nevertheless, this position was always subject to scientific criticism up until now. In other words, the creation of the universe is a classical problem where religious convictions clash with scientific positions. It has a long history, the summary of which lies beyond the scope of this paper. In antiquity, there's a debate between John Philoponus and Proclus, or John Philoponus and Aristotle, hallmarked the tension in a Christian faith. And the similar debate between theologians and philosophers was pretty much on the table in the Islamic scientific milieu, which started as early as the formative period of Kalam, namely the 8th and 9th century. It continued with Avicenna and accumulated in the footsteps of al-Ghazali's Tahafut al-Falasifa in the post-Ghazalian era. We shall start with the early mutakallimun to summarize in a nutshell both the essentials of the creationist and the eternalist position. For the sake of simplicity, by creationist position, I mean the Asharite mutakallimun summarized argument, and by the eternalist stance, I refer primarily to Avicenna's position. So the basis of the creationist position. In its early form, the creationist position was based on the distinction of God from everything else, namely that the world is created. That is to say, God's eternality was proven against the creation of the world. This is actually the four principles or four claims argument, which is a demonstration of God's existence. Here, the creation of the world is the basic assumption. Since accidents are created and atoms cannot exist devoid of accidents, the sum of atoms and accidents is created. Thus, the world is created. In the Asharite formula, the Mu'tazilite differs a little bit. If the world is created, it cannot depend on a created cause because it requires another created cause, which would run ad infinitum. Thus, so as to avoid an infinitely running process, there must be a cause that falls outside of the created circle, and this is God. With slight modifications, this reasoning was accepted both by the Asharites and the Mu'tazilites in the formative period. Note that here, the axis of the argument revolves around the concept of eternal, which has no beginning, and created, which has a beginning. We must note again that this is about proving the existence of God. This is the Ithbat al-Sani. The creation of the accidents and the creation of the world are part of a larger plan to prove God's existence. The fact that the world is created is easier to show. The change that we observe in the world, namely that I buy a green apple, whereas I could also buy the very same apple as a light green apple, implies that the green in my apple has a preponderator, which is not grounded in the thing itself in the apple. In the 9th century, philosophy actually was a way of seeing and understanding the world around us, similarly to Kalam. Thus, apart from elaborating on the logical toolkit of thinking, philosophy answered the burning questions of the given scientific milieu. Philosophy, among others, had practically Neoplatonized Aristotelian answers to such questions that theology posed, like God's existence, God's essence, attributes, creation, etc. The aforementioned eternalist position, the Burhan as-Siddiqi, as articulated by Avicenna, is partly an answer to the Kalam theory. Avicenna was a genuine philosopher who was well aware of the theological debates of his time. What he achieved was that he lifted the discussion one level upward. Avicenna was well aware of the theologian's principal assumption that the most basic notions are thing and existent. The thing is prior to existent, for the Mu'tazilites, for example, and existence and non-existence come upon the thing. This goes back to the Quran, to the Yasin Surah, which says that if God wants a thing, he tells be and then it is. So إِنَّمَا أَمَرَهُ إِذَا أَرَادَ شَيْئًا أَنْ يَقُولَ لَهُ كُنْ فَيَكُونَ. So this is the very famous kun fayakun ayah. Here, the most basic element is the thing, and the existence of non-existence comes upon. If it exists, it is either created or it's eternal. Avicenna, mainly due to the Aristotelian metaphysics, seems to think that existent, the mawjud, is the broader concept, the realization of which can be best grasped with modality. If a thing exists, it is either necessary or possible. That is to say, instead of proving God's existence by eternality and creation dichotomy, he applied necessity and possibility to the same problem. This is actually Robert Wisnowski's result. To recapitulate, everything that might exist is either possible in itself or necessary in itself. What is possible in itself is equivalent to the necessary to one another. The possible in itself is indifferent in terms of existence. It is not more likely to exist than not to exist. In other words, there is an infinite regress of causes, which is impossible if it is about the necessitating cause. From Avicenna's time on, the theological and philosophical formulations run parallel to each other. However, there is a fundamental ontological difference between the two. The philosophical position is built upon the possibility and necessity, whereas the theological position is built upon the creation and the eternity axis, but both reason with the impossibility of an infinite regress. Avicenna's argument uses different ontological bricks. The point is that Avicenna's solution cannot be understood without the Kalam problems, and the scholars have already pointed out his solution is a reassessment of former pieces of knowledge. The philosophical tradition provides the bricks, Kalam gives the concrete, but Avicenna just built a brand new, better looking house. As we saw above, in the formative period of Kalam, creation was a lesser problem than God's eternal existence. Creation was one of the claims upon which the argument for God's existence was built. Nevertheless, problems were always prompted by outer challenges. In this period, I mean the 9th or 10th century, it was the Dahriya or Ashab al-Hayula who presupposed an eternal underlying subject in which accidents come and go. That is, they were eternized. It is this particular sub-problem that compelled the theologians to react to this postulate. This solution was the third claim amongst the four, in the four principles argument, that atoms cannot be devoid of oxygen. Again, the world's creation was a lesser problem than the proof of God's existence. Nevertheless, this state of affairs has changed with Avicenna. Avicenna raised a bid with his modal argument, which fitted well into the Islamic narrative, although, as we saw, it leaked into the ship. The argument on necessity entailed that the world is causally dependent, created by God, so it is temporally eternal. In other words, Avicenna was breaking the limits. In the following, I would like to comment on the process of how theologians reacted to this challenge. If you look at the most influential thinkers of the 11th, 12th century, like Juwayni, Ghazali, and Shahristani, we see the following shift of discussion. I will take into consideration two main factors: the most basic division of existence, whether existence are divided into created or eternal, or into possible and necessary. Second, I will briefly summarize the arguments in favor of God's existence, which has a strong influence on the issue of the world's creation. That is to say, if a theologian accepts Avicenna's modal argument, the main problem is not God's existence anymore, but the creation of the world. Accordingly, from al-Juwayni on, the first chapter in the Theological Works, after the epistemological introduction, of course, is the creation of the world, Huduth al-Alam, not God's existence, as it was before Avicenna. Al-Juwayni, in his Kitab al-Irshad, sticks to the traditional theological way of distinction of existence. The world is the sum of atoms and accidents, and both atoms and accidents are created. He proves God's eternity with the impossibility of the infinite regress. He sticks to the Asharite reading of the particularization argument with a taint of modality. Created items are possible, but their time of creation is contingent. An apple can be created in time A and in time B, and the temporal difference of their coming to be is not grounded in the thing apple. Thus, there must be a specializing factor, a mukhassis, that preponderates the time of creation of the apple. Juwayni applies the term mumkin wajib in this context, echoing the modal distinction, but he refrains from identifying the mujib with the cause in an Avicennian way, because that would entail the eternity of the world. If God is an eternal necessitating cause, he eternally necessitates the world, which is eternal in this reading. Instead, he argues that the world must have a freely choosing preponderator that chooses the time of creation. And this is the usual Asharite solution. His answer to this challenge is simply that this assumption is ruled out because the creation of the world has already been settled based on the assumption that infinite past events are impossible. That is, for him, the starting point is the Kalam premise, not Avicenna's modality. The modal terms are in the system until it don't hurt the basic assumptions. Juwayni is well aware of the threat Avicenna poses. Shahristani credits him with another argument in the Nihaya, directed against the philosophers, whom he calls the enemies, shaped on the philosophical worldview. If we accept that the world is constituted of the four elements like fire, earth, air, and water, and the spheres, this arrangement could slightly be otherwise, which again postulates a freely choosing agent, which explains randomness, not a necessitating cause that is constant. The point is that Juwayni consciously reacted to the Avicennian proposal, but quickly recurred to the traditional Kalam solution. While Ghazali, in his al-Iqtisad fil i'tiqad, similarly follows the traditional theologian way. In proving God's existence, it starts from the world, the sum of created atoms and accidents. Every created has a cause, and its existence is possible. That is, he incorporates the modal argument to prove that every contingent being, if exists, has a cause and is possible, needing a murajjih, a preponderator. That is to say, al-Ghazali follows in Juwayni's footsteps. The world is created due to other reasons, like the impossibility of the infinite number of created items, like the circular motion of the celestial spheres. In the Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers, he also addressed the Fakhruddin question that the world is eternally possible. In the Tahafut, he aims to show the philosophers' incoherence, so he refutes their ideas with their own ideas. It is not about arguing from different principles, as in the Iqtisad or in the Kalam verse. Ghazali admits that the criterion of the world is eternally possible. Ghazali admits that the creation of the world is eternally possible, but for him, it doesn't entail that the world exists forever. If the world came into existence, it is finite, concrete thing, not the possible that could become at any time. It is just like place. Place is finite for the philosophers, although there is an infinite number of possibilities to place one thing upon another, but it will never be realized. That is, if the world came into existence, it is not eternal. This solution practically offers an existentialist insight into the problem, to look at the world as a concrete existence. As we will see, this is what Fakhraddin will do in his turn. As we move forward in time, one generation later, Shahristani, in the Nihayat al-Damfi al-Kalam, accepts the theologian's position, arguing heavily against the philosophers. Nevertheless, he refers to Greek philosophers who believed in creation, framing Aristotle and Avicenna as deviants who rejected the temporal creation of the world. Al-Shahristani extensively writes about the modal argument and its implications, and what is more, he makes it a central issue. In his discussion, he follows the path of his fellow predecessor, but goes one step forward. He does not rephrase the Avicennian tenet, but accepts it. That is, he accepts that the word's causal dependence on the necessitating cause, God, but he cannot endorse the implication that the word is eternally coexists with God. Shahristani has different paths to follow. Similarly to Juwayni, he rejects the idea of the infinity of created existence. He cannot accept that the spheres move circularly forever. I would say this is a very evergreen solution. For example, John Philoponus has a very similar argument. Or Shahristani argues that the necessitated effect being necessary through another is only accidental to the existent and doesn't imply coexistence. So he has his own toolkit to answer this challenge. In other words, he took pains to show that the modal distinction doesn't entail the eternity of the world. To achieve this goal, he used different principles from the theological tradition. An example of this is the 5 kinds of priority as elaborated in Aristotle's categories and commented upon by Avicenna. In order to argue against the word's co-eternity with God, they simply argued that God is not temporal, similarly to spatiality. Instead, they came up with a 6th kind of existential priority that doesn't involve time. If we focus on existence, God is the mujid who gives existence. That existence is certainly posterior to God's existence because God is the creator here. Nevertheless, this kind of priority is problematic. It is not evident how it differs from the temporal priority. As it seems, it is only a change of words. This short train of thought clearly shows that how this idea that Fakhraddin turns against Ibn Khaylan came to the fore as we move forward in time. As time passing, theologians engaged with it more and more until we reach Fakhraddin al-Razi, who turned out to be as much a philosopher as a theologian. Fakhraddin was a polymath. His oath covers a wide range of topics like tafsir, fiqh, kalam, and philosophy. When it comes to the creation of the world, he is like a modern-day astrophysicist who believes in God. Accordingly, Fakhraddin sometimes argues in favor of the universe's absolute creation, but at times he accepts the philosopher's position, namely that the world is created essentially, but is eternal temporal. It is not easy to grasp Fakhraddin's position on the question because he usually only enumerates the opinions of both sides with the corresponding counter-arguments. He doesn't take sides. In his theological works, like the Nihayat al-Uqul, al-Muhassal, Kitab al-Arba'in, and al-Matalib al-Aliyah, although he reiterates the creationist position along with its lengthy counter-arguments, he doesn't seem to be convinced. In the following, I will focus on 2 points: the division of existence and the modal argument as incorporated into his reasoning. In his theological works, he almost always starts from the Avicennian modality distinction when it comes to the division of existence. That is to say, he gets rid of the theologian's starting point that the principal distinction is between the eternal and created. This assumption applies to all of Fakhraddin's works. If something exists, it is either necessary in itself or possible in itself. In the Muhassal al-Afkar, he goes so far as to refute the theological distinction, reiterating Avicenna's argument from the Kitab al-Najat. This sets the agenda for him. Since the possible necessary distinction is the main axis, namely Fakhraddin has to cope with the assumption that there is a necessary causal relation between God and the world. God creates and necessitates the world, but in this case, the world is temporarily eternal. If we look at the structure of his theological works, whenever he treats the creationist position, he integrates the philosophical modal argument into the discussion. Fakhruddin, after the division of existence, continues with the understanding of the word, so what is the word, and the understanding of the creation, so what is hudud. Then he enumerates both the creationist and eternalist positions. Nevertheless, in the preliminary remarks, he usually answers the serious question that he posed to Ibn Ghaylan al-Baghi. If the world is possible of existence, does this possibility have a beginning or not? If the world's possibility has no beginning, then it is eternally possible. If it has a beginning, what was it before? Necessarily impossible. Neither option works. That is, the modal distinction is a trap because these primary concepts are closely linked to causality. It is in relation to a cause, and here it is God, that we define existence as effects, which links the whole system of creation to God, who is eternal. Fakhruddin, in some works of his, borrows the Shahristanian solution to the problem, namely that the world is possible being causally posterior to God. He also reiterates the usual theologian criticism that God cannot be temporal at all, so temporal coexistence is impossible. He also adduces the sixth kind of priority, which is based on existence. If it exists, it is posterior to God in existence, just like today is posterior to yesterday. Still, this assumption is not philosophically grounded. It is no surprise that these solutions were not entirely convincing for Fakhruddin. In the Kitab al-Arba'in and the Nihaya and the latest Matalib al-Aliyah, he comes up with his own answer, which seems to be based on the existential consideration of things. He suggests taking one concrete thing, a shay al-mu'ayyan, like this apple. If this apple exists, this apple is preceded by non-existence. Now, if this apple is possible so that its possibility has no beginning, it does not entail for it to be eternal, because on this condition, that it is preceded by non-existence, this apple cannot be eternal. Thus, if this concretely existing apple is in the focus, the statement that the possibility of this apple has no beginning doesn't entail that it is eternal. It is a rather existential way of saying things, where he doesn't talk about the quiddity of apple, the universal apple, but about the concrete thing. And this condition shows the way out of the problem. If I look at this world as an existing one and is created, it is preceded by non-existence. And as such, it is not temporally eternal. This answer clearly shows Fakhruddin's philosophical vein, as he makes use of the theological ideas in a logically coherent way, by introducing an existential condition into the inference. The existential condition is part of the logical teaching. A proposition can be absolute or existential, taken on the condition of its existence. It means that the predicate holds true of the subject until the subject exists. In this regard, the world is not eternal, because the world is preceded by non-existence, if I look at this very word. I think that Fakhruddin follows in the footsteps of al-Ghazali and Shahristani in focusing on the concrete existence. Nevertheless, he rephrases it in a logical framework. The world as a concrete existence is preceded by non-existence. The subject here is the particular, not the abstract concept, which exists only in the mind. Thus, it is a logical solution to the problem, meaning a shift of perspective. If we look at this as a process, we see practically an evolution of an idea. The model argument, known as the Burhan al-Siddiqin, was an answer to the theological challenges drawn from Aristotle, al-Farabi, and contemporary Kalam in Avicenna. That is to say, this result of Avicenna is born in a matrix of theological cultural problems, to which Avicenna offered a clear and elegant solution. The idea fitted into the Islamic theological system because it was born in that system. Nevertheless, it was challenging enough, breaking its limits. It implied a temporal eternity of the word, which went counter the holy scriptures. In this respect, it received a sharp criticism from al-Juwayni, who, in criticizing it, relied on the well-known Kalam argument. Al-Ghazali integrated it more and more into his system, but his answer and attitude were still that of a mutakallim. It was a Shahristani who made it into the center of his discussions, but he was adamant in rejecting its negative consequences. It was a phase of transition. At the end of today's survey, we find Fakhruddin Ar-Razi, who went so far as to accept the philosophical idea and try to logically answer to the challenges. In Ghazali's footsteps, he focuses on the particular existence, building a particular syllogism on the existential condition that shows that this world is not eternal. What we see here is a slow progress of how logic came to the fore in these sciences. This is practically the cultural change, a slow process in which the attitude towards philosophy, to be more precise to the Islamicized philosophy, became integrated into the Islamic sciences. Foreign influences are always affecting high culture, which shows a dynamic change. These ideas are always evolving in the given scientific milieu, always facing new challenges. In modern-day cultural studies, this process is similar to what Rain Rose says about the theory of a cultural bid. Where one raises a bid in a cultural setting, it provokes perhaps opposition, but slowly raises the level of reaction until it becomes integrated into the whole. Such a challenge inevitably enriches the high culture in a lively scientific exchange. Avicenna raised a bet with his innovations, which were not born in a vacuum. Avicenna was reacting to the cultural challenges of his time, so his ideas are a result of an already rich tradition. Nevertheless, his genius quickly came to the fore, since his solutions presented a strong alternative to the current traditions. Accordingly, it became integrated into the philosophizing Asharism, thanks to the thinkers like Fakhruddin Ar-Razi. Nevertheless, there are constant turnarounds in the Islamic culture, sometimes towards the Sharia, sometimes allowing for a more rationalistic approach. As the opponents, we should think on Ibn Taymiyyah or Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, for example, or the Maraga school and the Timurid court as the rationalists. This is what Ignaz Goldziher has already observed. Ignaz Goldziher 100 years ago, when much fewer works were available, noted the dynamic nature of Islamic science. In his essay on the new developments in Islam, in Hungarian as Islamu yabalakul, he rephrases the struggle between the Sunnah and Bid'ah, the tradition and innovation, in a very similar way as Rain Rose does. The new foreign elements and influences highly affected the Sunnah, the tradition, and hit a gap in the Sunnah as the unique criterion of truth. They erased bits and introduced smooth distinctions that opened the doors before certain bid'ahs. Actually, this is exactly what happened here, but in theology. Although we have much more books and information about the Islamic world, we might look at it deeper, gathering more particularities. Nevertheless, the true genius shows himself, not only in Avicenna's case. I would like to end my presentation with a poetic question. Despite the quantitative explosion of our data, are we entitled to claim that we know more than Ignaz Goldziher? Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for your lecture, Dr. Lánczky. And this concludes the lecture part of today's proceedings.